I have to make an observation, and it's a very, very interesting observation. This is the first Iraq evening I've been to the Frontline Club that hasn't been absolutely heaving, and that tells us a great deal. What it tells us we will discover in the course of this evening. Because, of course, it could be that the propaganda is working, that it's all over, and everything's worked, and it was one of the finest actions that any government ever took to invade Iraq. Or it could be that people are simply sick and tired of the whole subject. But we have a number of empty chairs here. Oh, that's you, General. Slight dose of the collie wobbles there, I think. We have an interesting situation here in that we have 3 star speakers, one of whom fresh out of Baghdad in the last few days, and the other, the last sane man to speak to Tony Blair about Iraq, and the other with a marvellous overview of all things to do with the conflict and its political consequences. And I thought the best way to start would be we would go round our 3 speakers, and then we will try the great Skype in the night and see if we can get hold of this rather splendid American general, Major General John Baptiste. John Baptiste is not Jean Baptiste, but John Baptiste. And what's interesting about him is he's not anti-war, he just thinks the whole thing was a cock-up. And we'll see where he's got tonight. Apparently he's changing planes somewhere, and that has led to some interesting sort of interference. So I want to start with Patrick Coburn, undoubtedly one of the most courageous correspondents to have covered the Iraq conflict. I know because he goes about in civilian, I was going to say drag, but actually he goes around in a clapped out old vehicle. You know, he's very brazen. They don't spot him in the back, but he is there. Whilst many of us are paying $3,000 a day to some crooked security outfit to protect us, he's unprotected and he gets access. And so I suppose, Patrick, given that you go very, very regularly, the question really is the situation in Baghdad significantly better? Can you, as a Westerner, at least if we take that particular test, go anywhere you want to?
No, you can't. I mean, people say Iraq is better, Baghdad is better. You ask an Iraqi, how is it? It's better. And somehow that gets transmuted into being normal. But it isn't. It means it's better than the bloodbath we had in 2006, when we were having 3,000 dead a month. And I think in June we had a terrific record, which is only 448 civilians killed. In May it was a couple of thousand. So it still is a very bloody place. You can't... Baghdad is a city of walls, these extraordinary sort of enormous grey concrete tombstones that create walls everywhere around districts in Baghdad, around buildings in Baghdad. The whole city is divided up into townships like some sort of a medieval Italian city, and is still, I suppose, Baghdad is still the most dangerous city in the world. One of the things I find frustrating about reporting is that people sort of somehow think things have got better there, haven't they? And even if you go into the green zone, you talk to people there, and they say, oh, you exaggerate, things are much better now. But invariably, when you say, well, right, and the hotel I normally stay in is about 500 yards from the nearest bridge over the Tigris into the green zone, come and see me in the hotel. And you would see their eyes flicker sideways and say, well, I have to talk to my security about that. And somehow they never turn up. It's a sort of worrying development too, because I can see Iraq becoming like a sort of Guatemala or Colombia, that people say an acceptable level of violence. Of course, what they mean is an acceptable level of violence in London and Washington, not for the poor Iraqis who are still being slaughtered. I always feel that the best barometer of how good or bad things are is that there are 2 million, 2.5 million Iraqis outside the country. there are another 1 million or more inside the country who fled their homes, living in horrible conditions, often either in penury, or and sometimes I've seen people sort of living in rubbish dumps, you know, living off maggoty food. They don't go home. If things were getting better, if this was true, they would go home, and they're not. A few are going back to Baghdad from Syria, but they don't go back to their houses. I have a driver who lost his house. I mean, it was his only possession. And I was saying to him, he's a Sunni, and he was in an area called Jihad, but in a Shia area of Jihad, which is in southwest Baghdad. You know, maybe I sort of know some people, maybe I can, if you're not going to the house, maybe we get some compensation, we could do some sort of deal. And he said, please, don't tell anybody I'm even in Baghdad, you know. The moment people in the house hear I'm around trying to get my house back, they'll send somebody to kill me. And that's the real atmosphere of Baghdad.
I must confess to myself that on the way out of Baghdad last time that I was there in March, we came back through Syria, and we went to the UN feeding center, and it was Mohammed's birthday, and so there were very few people there. But there was one man going through the lists of codes. Nobody has a name in the feeding center because a name leads killers to you. And so they have a code, and he said, mine isn't there. And he spoke to me in English, and he was in a suit, and he was perhaps 60. And he was clearly educated, and I tried to look. He told me what the code was for him, and it certainly wasn't there. And I said to him, you speak very good English. He said, yes, I went to Baghdad University. I studied political science and then engineering. And I said, so what was the job? What's the job you've left? Oh, he said, I was the manager of the Mosul-Baghdad-Basra railway line. And I said, but by God, they must need you now more than they've ever needed you at any time. He said, oh no, they've got a Polish contractor running the Mosul-Basra line because I was threatened with death, and I had to leave. And it is an extraordinary reflection that it's simpler for the occupying force to say, well, sod it, flee, and we'll get somebody, a Pole, to come in and run the railway. And when you're in Syria at these refugee camps, and they're not refugee camps because they're merely feeding centers, the amazing thing about Syria is the way in which the population in Damascus have welcomed them into their homes. People have found every bedroom they can find and filled them with refugees. I mean, the Syrian heroism in the face of what has happened in Iraq is simply extraordinary. The humanitarian, the way the population of Syria has risen to embrace the people who've been thrown out. They're middle class, they're easy to manage, but that doesn't ameliorate the reality that what that country has done, and Jordan too, to a slightly lesser extent, but to much the same extent, is in itself quite remarkable. But here was a man with a vital job to do, and in Damascus, not a single American official to be found anywhere near either the feeding center or anywhere where refugees gathered, no inventory being compiled of all the people and all the skills, and everybody you speak to of a certain age, and that's sort of you and me and even you and you, are working on the assumption that they will never go back. Maybe their children will go back, but they will never go back. They see no expectation of that, and they're looking for any which way to go somewhere where they can make a new life at the age of 55, at 60 or whatever. And these are the realities that are not discussed. Now, Toby Dodge, I said slightly flippantly, was the last sane man to talk to Tony Blair before he invaded Iraq. But he really was one of 3 people, I'm not quite sure how it came about even, who were called in, 3 experts who were called in to talk a bit of sense to Tony Blair about what the consequences of an invasion of Iraq might be. And they told him bluntly, and, you know, nice man that he is, Tony Blair, I say that in inverted commas, Tony Blair entertained them, I think, for about 90 minutes, or, I mean, a long time for a Prime Minister, a very long time for Tony Blair. And they told him as he saw it. So I thought it might be interesting to ask Toby, the phone goes, and it's Gordon. What do you think we should do about Iraq? What advice would you give him as we speak?
Well, let me broaden that out a bit and say that if the phone goes and it's one incumbent possibly outgoing and two transatlantic incoming potential presidents, that would be... I mean, for Brown, what struck me, I was in Baghdad in March and April at the start and then in the aftermath of the Basra campaign launched by Prime Minister Maliki, and what struck me was the resentment and anger focused on the British by Maliki. Allegedly, apparently Maliki refused to see senior British commanders down in Basra when he arrived, that they were seen to have abdicated any responsibility for the mess that Basra was in, to a certain extent still is. So I would... The
extraordinary figure they put up from the Ministry of Defence, an official on Channel 4 News admitted quite openly that their man had been short-shrifted and told to get out.
I think the British are largely irrelevant in Iraq now. If we were talking beforehand, and I think Patrick and I agree, one wonders the extent that the Americans have much influence these days, but the British have none. So if Gordon's people were ringing me, I'd tell him to look to the British economy and not waste his time in Baghdad or Basra. I think what's much more interesting as we run into the US presidentials is the polemical, passionate, divisive debate on Iraq in Washington that would clearly structure some of the presidential campaign, which again is very worrying, I think, because if this invasion screwed up so badly, one of the key reasons for it had nothing much to do with Iraq, that those people, like Tony Blair and much more importantly George Bush, had no knowledge and cared less about Iraq. And it strikes me that both McCain and Obama's policies have got very little to do with Iraq and an awful lot to do with elections and polemicism and the ideological debate in Washington, which is going to make for a series of really bad policy decisions through the transition into the next presidential term.
Sorry, Toby, could I make a small point on this? But one thing that strikes me about, we were talking about this earlier, about Obama and McCain, is that they both haven't learnt the sort of decisive, what seems to me the main thing that comes out of Iraq over the last 5 years, is they both assume that America can decide what's going to happen in Iraq, that they make the political weather in Iraq. But this simply isn't true. That if, for instance, McCain, whether it's Senator McCain or President McCain, decides to stay forever, but let's say somebody goes to a small alleyway in Najaf and goes and consults with the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, who says, no, the occupation must end, then the occupation will end. These people don't have the power to do it anymore. But all this is discussed on American television and American newspapers as if this was 2003, early part of 2003, in the brief moment when the Americans thought they could decide everything that happened in Iraq. But actually that just isn't the situation.
Just to add to that, I think if General Petraeus repeatedly says this has a political solution, what's painfully apparent about this huge American embassy, both in the palace and now this new 1.5 km long building they've built, is they have almost no influence over the civilian state building aspect of it, and acknowledged very little ability to bring the warring parties together. So I think that message, I think, is read loud and clear in Baghdad, but not in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, you're somebody who fled Iraq in '79, but you looked to the region all this time. The thing which does strike you when you're in Baghdad is that embassy, the biggest embassy anywhere in the world, by any country. 3,000 people can be accommodated in it to sleep, let alone work. 3 military bases on a scale that competes with anything that was built after the Second World War in Germany. To me, it seems to me there are a whole lot of different streams running. You have Obama standing up saying we can be out in 16 months, but you see a dynamic which is about staying for 100 years, as McCain says. How do you read it?
Well, I've been, like my other colleagues, I've been very often to Baghdad, and I was there just recently, most recently in March, and I had the pleasure, or the dubious pleasure, as you may say, of working very closely with the Iraqi government and being involved closely in attempts to rebuild the machinery of the state. And I must say that although I've been very skeptical about the ability of many of the people that were brought in to run Iraq, including many of the exiles, I think that a lot has been achieved, particularly over the last year. As a tipping point, an elusive tipping point has been reached sometime early 2007, I think, that in tandem with the reduction in the violence, which had many reasons, also meant the revival, the sort of awakening of the Iraqi state machinery. And this has been something that has been building up. Admittedly, not a lot of it has been translated into tangible results for Iraqis, although some of it is, and particularly the reduction in the violence. But what is most importantly is the change in mood and a change in atmosphere. Mm. There is much more hope and much more confidence in Iraq.
And an Iraqization of the political
system,
power and system.
And the culmination of that is the Iraqi government's demand, most recently voiced by Maliki and his security advisor, for a timetable for withdrawal.
And this is a man the Americans at one stage wanted to get out.
Yeah, well, these are, I mean, the point is, and I think what is most important about the events that happened, especially in the past several weeks with the oil contracts and with the change from the sort of the sweetheart deals to an open bidding process now and all these things, is that a lot of the expectations from the invasion have not taken place, on both the good side and the bad side. On one side, America didn't get the domino effect. Iraq didn't become a sort of a model to be replicated. It was the pain and suffering that associated the change and the cost of it. I think nobody in their right mind would want to replicate that in their own country. I think the military bases, I would be very surprised, although making prediction is not as an ungrateful task. I would be very surprised, given the way the Iraqis are moving, including US allies in Iraq, and the way they're changing in their thinking. I'd be very surprised that there will be military bases of this scale in Iraq proper. Maybe in Kurdistan. That's a different situation. And also in terms of the oil and all these things, the Iraqi Minister of Finance recently gave an interview talking with very pride and impression about his control over what is expected to be $100 billion this year. $100 billion, that's a lot of money. And nobody will give that easily, whether it's for friends in Iran or friends in Washington or friends anywhere. That's what happens. And so we're seeing an Iraqi state consolidating, awakening. It's not going to be as advertised. It's sort of a Jeffersonian democracy that sort of shines the beacon of democracy in the Middle East. It will not be much better or much different from its neighbors. But it will be a state. The nightmare scenario of an Iraq disintegrating and turning into a festering sore in the region and turning into a regional confrontation, which I'm sure Toby may have warned Tony Blair about the possibility of, as we all did, is also not happening.
But with a very autonomous Kurdistan.
Kurdistan, I think, given Kurdistan has been moving independently since '91. It's culturally distinct. It's economically distinct. There are links and there's integration, but there's very difficult to imagine it integrating in Iraq in a unified state model. And what the problematic with Kurdistan is that if you grant the same degree that autonomy that Kurdistan deserves and is exercising now to the rest of Iraq, then you have a problem. Then you have a full disintegration. At the same time, you cannot deny Kurdistan. You cannot scale back the level of independence that Kurdistan has. So there is a dilemma there. And actually, I'm afraid there is potential for conflict there, too.
Over Kirkuk.
Over Kirkuk and over the whole periphery of Kurdistan. What size is Kurdistan going to be? How much influence it has? How independent it will be? And this is going to be, as soon as the current package of issues is completed, particularly with Diyala and the other insurgency operation, I think we're seeing sort of stirrings of possibility of tensions around Kurdistan, which are very alarming.
Well, we'll come back to that. Shall we have a shot at the general? Don't you love it? General Batista, do you hear us? It's Jon Snow here in London. Aha. Love it.
Hello, John Batista.
General, this is Jon Snow here in London at the Frontline Club.
Yeah, how are you?
We're good, and just to give you the picture, there's about 250 people here gathered talking about the present state of Iraq and the future. We're an eclectic mix of journalists, of fellow travellers, pinkos, undesirables, and desirables. So that sort of, I've tried to give you a sort of no-holes-barred picture of who we are. But we've had, each of us has been in Iraq pretty recently. But what we wanted to ask you was, given your sense, which is never that you've been anti the war, but that you've been anti the conduct of the war, what your reading of the present situation is, and whether you're any more optimistic than when you left Iraq in 2003, I think it was.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're hearing you well. Did you hear my question okay?
Can you say again the question? I'm sorry, I'm on a cell phone.
Yes, of course. The question is, given your position, which was never anti-war, but anti the conduct of the war, what is your, are you more optimistic now? What's your sense of the present situation?
You know, you're right. I am definitely not anti-war. In fact, I'm all about taking our great nations to war in the proper way. That is, with a comprehensive strategy that's been well thought out. We shouldn't go to war until we've exhausted all diplomatic, political, and economic measures, components of strategy. Going to war is the last resort. The concern I have is that our countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, don't have a comprehensive strategy to deal with global Islamic extremism, Al-Qaeda or whatever. And I'm afraid that our limited resources aren't being properly applied.
But when you say that, the initial confrontation of what you describe as Islamic extremism was Afghanistan, and was going, some would argue, quite well, until you went to the one country where Islamic extremism led to execution.
Well, I agree with that, exactly. And I worry that there is no post-surge strategy, and the decision makers haven't gone to school on the historical record, the great lessons like people like Gertrude Bell learned the hard way, that we're dealing with a very strange entity in Iraq. There is no sense of Iraqi nationalism. There's the forces of Sunni versus Shia, tribal on Kurd, Arab on Kurd, tribalism. All of these factors are at play.
So, look, I mean, let me say, for example, that President Obama or President McCain summons you to the Oval Office in January. What's your advice?
Number one is, let's get serious about a comprehensive strategy to deal with worldwide Islamic extremism, Al-Qaeda in its many forms, similar organizations. The answer is not to commit our great militaries. The answers are more rooted in diplomacy and political and economic hard work. A lot of the issues that we're facing in our world today is the fact that the riches are completely out of balance. We have a problem, and I'm afraid that right now we aren't postured with a strategy for success.
That's your analysis, but then what do you actually tell the president to do?
Well, let's get all the people that have a stake in this game together to develop a proper strategy. Let's determine the main effort. let's figure out how we are going to address worldwide Islamic extremism. We don't have an answer to that. You don't, I don't. There is no plan. There is no post-surge strategy. We have limited resources, and we have to focus what we have.
But that might mean you had to ask some very awkward questions. You might have to inspect what the West's relationship with Saudi Arabia amounted to, and to what extent Saudi Arabia itself was perhaps one of the greatest threats when you come to examine the extremism you describe.
Precisely. I mean, there'll be some very tough questions that have to be answered, but at the end of the day, we, the United States and the United Kingdom, don't have a proper strategy to deal with this global Islamic extremism. And we're frittering away our limited resources in places like Iraq.
General, you've sown some very useful seeds for us. We're going to continue our discussion here, but I'm extremely grateful to you for taking our call, and I wish you well wherever you are, and Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see if we can go to Baghdad now and have a word with Dr. Ali Al-Dabakh. Ali Al-Dabakh, can you hear me? It's John Snow here in London. We're just waiting for that unmistakable Baghdadi ringtone, which of course is almost invariably an American cell net. We may not be so fortunate. Aha.
It is MCI, you're right.
MCI, yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, Dr. Al-Dabakh, it's John Snow here in London at the Frontline Club. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. I know it's late there. It's at least 11 or 11:30, so thank you very much for joining us. Just to tell you, this is a meeting of about 250 journalists and fellow travelers and people who have a deep interest in the future of Iraq, gathered at the Frontline Club. And we just wondered if we could have a couple of minutes questioning you about the present position. Let me just say that we have had a discussion involving three journalists and academic analysts, each of whom has been to Iraq very recently, and each of whom describe in different ways an improving situation. But most interestingly, they describe a situation in which political power and strategy and levers have moved inexorably into Iraqi hands, that Iraqis are now running Iraq. Is that a correct analysis?
Yes, greeting for all the people who are there with you, and I'm delighted to join you to talk about the Iraq issue. Definitely the situation in Iraq, everybody has noticed there in Iraq is improving and showing that more Iraqis, more control from the Iraqis in the security issue and the development of the security situation entitled the Iraqi and the Iraqi government to start the reconstruction of the country and distribution of the wealth and the revenue for the Iraqis. As everybody has heard that last week we had approved a supplementary budget of $21 billion extra for the budget, which was $48 billion. So the total budget for 2008 around $70 million, which stands as the highest budget for the Iraqis. I think that the Iraqis are, the situation in Iraq is improving rapidly, and with the situation, with the improvement in the political situation, there is a great need for having a political reform. Politically, the vacant ministries the names being awarded to the Council of Representatives today for the next week approval, which will bring the Sunnis Arab back to the cabinet in order to have a full cabinet running. So I am ready to have any question if any of the gentlemen there want to raise.
Well, Yahya Saeed, who works at the London School of Economics, he would like to ask you a question.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
Welcome.
Ali, we were all delighted to hear the. We all heard the Prime Minister and his Mr. Maliki and the National Security Advisor Dr. Rubai state last week that Iraq will be expecting a timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. troops with a definitive deadline for their departure from the country to be included in the memorandum of understanding that Iraq is negotiating.
The line is breaking, but I understand you are talking about the Iraqi-American agreement,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, I'm talking about the new Iraqi request or demand that the agreement include a timetable for withdrawal. Can you elaborate on that and on the status, on what is the response that Iraq is getting from the U.S. and give us maybe some background on that? I understand that Dr. Rubai made that statement.
You know, the principle. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I hope.
Go ahead. Tafadhal.
Sorry, sir. The line was breaking, but I hope that my voice will be clear for you, all of you. There are principles which Iraqi government is calling for. The main principle is the sovereignty of the country and the high interest of the Iraqi people. These two main issues should be maintained in any agreement or any memorandum of understanding which is negotiated right now with the United States. Iraq is looking for a time horizon in which that the troops, the American troops, will be leaving the country on a specific date which we agreed. Iraqi government has proposed the end of 2010 for withdrawal of the American troops of Iraq. So we are talking on a MOU which regulates the presence of the American troops here in Iraq during this period. There is a lot of changes being encountered in the last month in all the meetings and the round of negotiation with the Americans, in which all the details is being reviewed in a way to maintain such two principles which I have mentioned earlier. This is applicable for the number of the troops, the movement, the immunity, and all the legal issue for the presence of the American troops. This MOU, which is negotiable now with the United States, is my voice clear for you?
Very clear, and it's very fascinating for us to hear what you're saying. Keep going. Very, very good.
I think he's finished.
I think we can ask you another question. We will ask you another question. Another question, anybody want to put to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I don't know if the microphone can pick up. This is a Kurdish member of the audience here.
Good evening, Mr. Tabak. I am Kurdish journalist. I'd like to ask why your government doesn't implement Article 114. And also recently President Talabani declared that they know who's behind these bombing campaigns. He meant, I think, neighbor countries. What do you comment about this? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the sound was clear, but as I understand that, following the gentleman asking about the close report about Kirkuk.
Yes.
The situation now, two parties in Iraq, the federal government in Baghdad and the regional government in Erbil, both they had satisfied and agreed that the situation in Kirkuk is not suitable now to have the referendum, which needs to have a and in order to be ready for having referendum about Kirkuk. The political situation is not sound enough, is not good enough in order to have this referendum. So there is a good and there is an understanding between the federal government as well as the regional government to postpone this issue. They had asked the United Nations to play a role in giving some of the suggestions and the plan for having a solution, amicable and peaceful solution in Kirkuk. We believe in Iraq, in Baghdad, that there should be a consensus solution among the components and the fractions which they are in Kirkuk. Nothing could be imposed on Kirkuk from any party, from any faction, from any component on the other. We are seeking for a permanent and fair solution for all components of Kirkuk. Regarding the election, the Kurdish idea that the election in Kirkuk should be postponed. Today there was a discussion yesterday and today in the Council of Representatives that the Kirkuk issue in the Kirkuk election should be postponed for a limited period. If in the election law, if a ruling election being approved, then it will entitle the government, the Baghdad government, to postpone the election in Kirkuk. But we believe that Kirkuk issue should not stop the election and should not forbid the election in other governments. That is why we are calling for a ruling election in Iraq so that we could postpone the election in Kirkuk or in any city that it might not be suitable to have elections at the time when we agreed upon.
Dr. Al-Dabakh, let's just have one last question from this end, and it's again from Yahya Saeed.
I'm sorry, Dr. Dabakh, for asking you again, but could you, we all heard the press conference of the Minister of Oil, Dr. Shahristani, I think also last week or 2 weeks ago, where he declared that there will be a bidding round for oil contracts for the development of Iraq's major fields. I understand that there is still no oil law, and there is still no final agreement on the oil law. Could you give us some updates on the status of the law and of the status of engagement with international oil companies over Iraq's oil?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Said. The oil law, the hydrocarbon law, there is an agreement between Baghdad and Erbil that this will go on a package. The hydrocarbon law, the revenue sharing law, and the National Iraqi Oil Company law, 3 legislation should go in one package. Now they are working, a team of experts are working in order to prepare this one so that it could be approved in the Council of Representatives. I think with the atmosphere, with the better atmosphere, political atmosphere which has been now in Iraq, the hydrocarbon law, it is a great possibility that it will be passed this year. Regarding the oil contract, the Ministry of Oil had declared that 6 giant oil fields plus 2 gas fields is the first round of bidding, which will be distributed. The specification and the conditions will be starting. Distribution of such specification will be on month of September till month of March 2009. This is regarding this oil field. As a service contract, which the present law is entitled the Ministry of Oil to go in any agreement with any oil company based on the present law, not only the hydrocarbon law, not waiting the hydrocarbon law. the hydrocarbon law, it is for the benefit of Iraq. Definitely, although that the others are calling to approve this this legislation, but we believe in Iraq this will entitle Iraqis to develop and promote the oil sector, which is very important as it is the main source of income for Iraq. I believe that both the central government, the federal government in Baghdad, and the regional government is eager to have this hydrocarbon law approved with the present atmosphere which is being created, and most hopefully that after the cabinet being completed, there is a great chance for hydrocarbon law as well as the other laws to be passed in the Council of Representatives.
Dr. Ali Al-Bagha, just one last question from Patrick Coburn.
Will the memorandum of understanding between Iraq and the United States, when it is agreed by the governments, be submitted to the Iraqi parliament?
Although that is called MOU, which most of the people, they feel that it is not necessary to be approved by the Council of Representatives, but the Prime Minister feels that this is it's binding Iraq. There is a commitment from Iraqi government towards the United States, as well as the counter commitment from United States, which the Prime Minister feels that it needs to be approved by the Council of Representatives in order to get a majority of Iraqis accept this memorandum of understanding, which is for a temporary period. There is no, so far right now on a table, status of force agreement. It is being replaced by this memorandum of understanding, which again, it needs a majority of Iraqi acceptance. I just want to mention one important issue, that no government in Iraq right now could impose or could pass anything which the political group and parties cannot accept or reject. It is not easy to for this government, as well as any government in Iraq, to pass or to approve or to go in agreement with any government, whether it is the United States or others, without the approval of the political parties, which is at the end they represent the main Iraqi will and interest.
Dr. Dabakh, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to us. We're really grateful to you for staying up to talk to us, and I hope you sleep well, and we wish you and Iraq all the very best. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir, for you and for all the people around. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, that was rather remarkable, wasn't it? I mean, let's face it. Hearing direct from the horse's mouth. Let's deconstruct what we have heard in the last 20 minutes. What did you make of the answer? They're going to be subjected to the Parliament then?
Sure, yes. No, it's interesting that they sort of commit to that. Have they committed to that before? Were you conscious of that?
I think it confirms my expectations of what was happening to this treaty. Again, it started out back in November of last year with a very ambitious agenda of building a sort of treaty that binded the U.S. with Germany and the U.S. with Japan, sort of a multi-decade agreement that will involve the major bases that you have talked about, and sort of a long-term strategic relationship. And this thing, there was sort of a gap of perceptions, if you like, and once they started to negotiate, I think the National Security Advisor, Muwaffaq al-Rubai, who was the front person for that, went to the Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf to sort of get a green light on that. And allegedly, word has it that Sistani may have refused to meet him, or at least refused to accept, to look at the principles of agreements that the Prime Minister then signed with George Bush. And ever since, there have been a progressive downgrading of that treaty to meet with the realities on the ground, and actually to meet with the changing mood inside the Green Zone itself, inside the Iraqi government itself. Because the Iraqi government, as it was becoming more and more confident of what it can do in Basra, in Sadr city, and we can, you know, I mean, it's all caveated and conditional.
But what a heroic figure Sistani is.
Well, Sistani is not a heroic figure. He's, you know, he has a parish. He has his flock that he has to take care of, and he has a good sense of.
But he's done it in an extraordinarily moderate and political.
In a quiet way. Yeah.
Quiet way.
Because he's a quietist. So.
Well, and an unseenist.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he also has a sense of what majority opinion is. Yeah. So it's sort of wait till there's.
But I wouldn't also take the credit completely away from the Iraqi government. I mean, for example, part of the Maliki's insistence and the Iraqi government's insistence on bringing it to parliament, it's actually a bargaining tool with the U.S. by saying, look, we may want you to stay longer, we may want more troops and so on, but you know, we have a parliament that we have.
But at its crudest, didn't British surgeons save the life of a man who's made life intolerable for the Americans?
Excuse me?
At its crudest, didn't British surgeons save the life
of
a man?
Yes.
Sistani made life wonderful for the Americans. If not for Sistani, there would have been much more bloodshed in Iraq, both Iraqis and Americans.
Yes, but I mean...
And there's some speculation that his visit to London was more diplomatic
than kidney stones.
I mean, if you, just to pick up on Yahya's point, this was a treaty that the US government has, I think, 60 lawyers working on in Baghdad. And in the last 2 weeks, coming through London has been their most senior negotiator and the Iraqi senior negotiator. Their senior negotiator comes through, everything's fine, we're getting on really well, it's going to go through. Next week, the senior Iraqi negotiator comes through and said, it's going to be a memorandum of understanding. We can't sort it out in the time. We've both started at very extreme positions on either side. And I mean, given the optimism until very recently coming out of Washington, this is, I think, a diplomatic faux pas of quite major proportions from Washington. They misunderstood the extent of the work that needed to be done and the malleability of the ruling elite.
But I think that... Sorry. No, I think that Baptiste was quite wrong at one point he made. He said there's no Iraqi nationalism. This just isn't true. Sometimes it looks like that because Shia and Sunni Kurds aren't Iraqi nationalists, have different visions of Iraqi nationalism, which often excludes the other community. So you could say it's contradictory nationalism, but it is nationalism, and it's quite intense nationalism. And I think that the Americans, from the beginning, and the British have underestimated this, as we saw Baptiste doing just now.
I think there's a general lag in understanding the situation in Iraq, and it's a function, of course, of the security mess and the fact that it's a very dynamic situation. Things have been moving very quickly, and what we heard from Baptiste is exactly that. He's still judging Iraq by the parameters of 2006. I mean, the Sunni Shia Kurdish thing. I mean, it's such a primitive, if you like, tool to understanding Iraq, and it may have been true at some point at the highest intensity of the conflict in 2006, but it quickly changed because immediately you had fissures, intra-Shia fissures, intra-Sunni fissures emerging.
But if one were to put a crude spin on it, the effect of the surge has been to nationalize Iraq, to re-Iraqicize Iraq.
There's been a pause.
In a certain sense. I mean, you had first 2003, 2004, you did have Iraqi nationalism. I remember the first American siege of Fallujah, which is a Sunni city, that you had not just Sunni, but sort of Shia in Baghdad, including middle-class Shia, peasants in buses going to give blood for the people of Fallujah. Then within a few months, we had the big car bombs in Baghdad. Then after a bit, the people in the Shia and Fallujah were all in favor of hammering Fallujah into the ground. And really that happened you had a couple of years, which really, although Tony Blair and Bush kept denying there was a civil war, there was an extraordinary bloody civil war, bloodier than most civil wars. You know, we had a civil war in this country 300 years ago, nothing like as bloody as what we had in Baghdad. And at that point, you know, it's really quite simple. If, let's say I was a Sunni in West Baghdad, and somebody was going to kick my door at 3 in the morning, would I prefer it to be a Shia police commando who's probably going to take me away and torture me and kill me? Or would I prefer the American Marine? Well, actually, I would prefer neither. But at the end of the day, every time, it would be the American Marine. Now, as I don't think it's exactly the surge, but as sectarian warfare ebbs, and it ebbs basically because the Shia mostly control Baghdad now, nationalism goes up. People aren't quite so terrified of each other. And then remember, they never like the Americans much anyway. So I think that's the sort of the way it's developed.
But if we bring it back to the American presidential contest, this plays into Obama's campaign very conveniently.
Well, it plays into both.
There's only 4 months difference between these two deadlines.
No, but if you think Obama can claim that he can pull his troops out in 16 months because Iraq isn't in the middle of civil war, the question he has to ask, and I think there are a multifaceted set of reasons why the civil war has paused and not ended, but will pulling US troops out trigger it again? We must remember that Bush's "We stand down as Iraqi troops stand up" statement in 2005, General Casey, now chief of the army, then running troops in Iraq, was desperately trying to pull troops out as the civil war started. So Obama's position looks plausible because the violence has dropped away, as McCain's position looks plausible because the violence has dropped away. Both of them, to a certain extent, are desperately holding on for different reasons to the sustainability of the pause in the civil war. And I'm not, because the reasons for the pause in the civil war are manifold, I'm not sure it's sustainable. I can't, if you ask the question, why won't it start again? You've still got a large Sunni population in Baghdad with access to arms. You've still got Muqtada al-Sadr's militia certainly standing back but not completely demobilized, and you've still got an al-Qaeda capacity just who could come bring those mass casualty bombs back into Baghdad. So the civil war is paused but not stopped, I think. And that's the thing each candidate has to wrestle with.
Who would like to ask a question? Yeah.
Hello, my name is David Niblock. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been to Iraq several times, most often to Kirkuk and the Kurdish north. I was a little disturbed by, in fact, I felt that the Iraqi minister evaded the question about Article 114, and he talks about waiting until the political situation is ripe and ready for the referendum. Well, what is that? Is that some kind of gerrymandering? Because in 2005, I was there for the election, and everybody in Kirkuk then was deemed to be sane enough and able enough to vote for the government. I don't know why they're not able to vote for their own future at the moment. And a lot of analysts I've spoken with consider the future of Kirkuk to be something of a microcosm for the whole future of what will happen in, hopefully, post-conflict Iraq. So I was really wondering what the panel, what their attitude or what your opinions are about the Kirkuk referendum and the various options that are available post that referendum.
You know, Zabari was here on Monday, and he gave a Chatham House talk. And it's very interesting because obviously we asked him a lot about that, and we got very little in return. I mean, it's just the subject that doesn't wish to speak its name. I mean, it's...
Well, what really worries me is like Patrick, I travelled around in the area, embedded with locals, if you like, with local cars and staying in the local house. And at that time, the Kurds are being incredibly patient, but it's building. And finally, they're the one group of people who haven't really fought very hard so far. And I don't think they're going to wait much longer if they get denied their democratic right.
Yeah, I mean, you heard what the spokesperson suggested. Actually, what he called the consensus solution is actually the Iraqi government's position. It's the non-Kurdish position, because the consensus solution is code for the proposal of allocating fixed portions of the council in Kirkuk to the various communities. So, if you like, establishing a sort of an upper chamber. Whereas the Kurdish position is, let's have a referendum and see where things go one way or the other. I think the problem with Kirkuk, as with many of the other issues, is that the Article 140 was negotiated in a different political context, in a different political environment.
Sorry, then there may be somebody in the audience who doesn't know what Article 140 is.
Well, the Article 140 is what governs the settlement of Kirkuk. It's an agreement basically to normalize the situation in Kirkuk, as in to allow to reverse some of the population movements that were carried out by Saddam's regime, to allow the refugees, the Kurds who have been forced out of the province to return, and to get to allow some of those Arabs and non-Kurds who came to the province or who were brought to the province by the regime to transfer to other regions, and after that to hold a referendum on the status, on the future of Kirkuk, either as, you know, whether it goes to the Kurdistan region or whether parts of it become part of the Kurdistan region based on the majority. And what I was trying to say is that this agreement, which largely satisfies Kurdish demands or expectations of what should happen to Kirkuk, was negotiated in a different context. And what you're having now is an attempt to renegotiate that deal by the other side, if you like, the non-Kurdish side of the Iraqi political spectrum, which is much more confident and much more consolidated and much stronger today than it was when that deal was negotiated. And obviously, as expected, the Kurds are very upset because they think they have a deal, it's part of the constitution. You know, that's a renegotiation
But I think that the Kurdish influence is diminishing just for the same reason the American influence is diminishing, as the Sunni and Shia Arabs, above all the Shia, consolidate their grip on power.
Yeah, without diverting too much from the Kurdish issue, I wanted to come back to this whole sustainability of the pause in the civil war, because this is really the big question, is this emerging political elite around Maliki. And it's mostly Shia, it's mostly Dawa party, but it also includes a lot of people from the state apparatus. I'm not going to call them ex-Ba'athists, but many of them are. People, you know, technocrats from the machinery of government, the military, the new Iraqi military, which is 70% of the officer corps of it is from the previous military. This machinery of government is fighting to establish not only its capacity to deliver services, which it is not being too successful at, but nonetheless successful to some extent, but also trying to establish legitimacy. And this whole negotiation about timetable withdrawal is also about legitimacy. Now, to the extent that this political movement or political group does establish legitimacy, it will be able to hold civil war off.
I think the danger is that there's danger of overstating the coherence of that political group. You travel through the senior technocrats and especially the senior members of the military, and there is outright and open contempt for the political leadership. And what we have is a very, it looks very familiar to a historian, that you have a huge overgrown army built by a quasi-colonial presence that's declining, an unpopular, largely unrepresentative elite running the Iraqi state that's dependent on the Iraqi army for its survival. That looks like a post-colonial coup to me.
Yeah, but I think there's a sort of ambivalence among Iraqis, and including within the government. How strong are they? Within the same conversation, they'll jump backwards and forwards. I mean, one Kurdish leader was saying to me, look, last week that in March, we thought Maliki was a no-hoper and the parties were basically getting together to get rid of him. Suddenly he has this almost accidental victory in Basra, and he thinks, and now he's cock-a-hoop and is not listening to us. But it is sort of, you know, that the army, is much more confident. But wherever they are, they also know they didn't actually beat the Mahdi army, that it was the Americans who did the fighting. Or when they did the fighting, the Americans were right behind them. So let's say in Amara province, which is a big Mahdi army stronghold, the Iraqi army is...
If I may, they beat the Mahdi army where it matters. The Mahdi army, they stared down the Mahdi army in Basra and in Sadr city.
Wait a minute, they were in open conflict with the Mahdi army. They could only fight for 2 days before the US had to come in with combat.
I mean, you could
but
say...
the main thing that happened was that the Mahdi army realized that it will be more costly for them politically to continue the fight. The Mahdi army could have continued to fight. There would have been much more bloodshed in Basra. But what happened was the Maliki won the public opinion battle, if you like, with the Mahdi army, both in Basra and in Baghdad. And that is what gave him the wind, if you like, in his sails, and the machinery of government that he's building, and that is where this confidence is coming from.
Yeah, but they stopped fighting because Muqtada told them to, and the Iranians wouldn't also,
well,
you know...
I think if they believed they had a political momentum, because we're talking about the survival of the Sadrist movement, actually.
Yeah.
And they realized that actually the people in Basra and Sadr city, including the Shia, the people who are most closely associated with them, would rather see an Iraqi uniformed soldier on the street than to see a Mahdi army militiaman dispensing some sort of vigilante justice. And this is exactly what Maliki is building on and is trying to build into consolidate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I don't think it's quite the way thing happened, because the Mahdi army wasn't planning to put it to a vote. But sorry, I mean, there was another point I wanted to make, which was you find this sort of ambivalence in the government. The one moment they feel really confident, and the next moment they feel, my God, you know, we might lose at any moment. And also, as Toby was saying, there is a sort of anarchy in sort of central Iraq. I mean, some friends of mine in Agence France Presse were arrested by the Iraqi army last week in Abu Ghraib. They didn't have their phones confiscated, so they rang up the Ministry of Defense, who said, they said, who's arrested you? They said the Muthana Brigade. And they said, oh, we don't control them.
That's the big point, that the Prime Minister has, through using Operations Centre and the Office of the Commander-in-Chief, is trying to undermine the central coherence of the military.
I'm going to bring in two questions, you and you, please. Yeah, first to the guy in the glasses at the back.
Just a quick explanation and a question to Patrick. The Article 140 is not only about Kirkuk and disputed areas. Yes. So Kirkuk is a bargaining chip among the mainly Sunnis and Shiites, among the Shiites and the Kurds, and partially the Kurds. So it is not about only the Kurds. My question to Patrick, he was talking about nationalism. Were you surprised, or at least you didn't expect the rejection of Maliki to the American terms in this agreement, and suggesting this new memorandum of understanding? Do you call it, this is the nationalism of the Shiites?
I think there was a nationalist reaction, I mean, against it. Initially, people seemed surprisingly passive about this agreement, because it was being produced as this, we have this sort of agreement with US has this sort of agreement with 80 countries. Of course, the Americans didn't want to produce it as a treaty, because then they'd have to submit it to Congress, so the administration didn't want to do this. And also the Iraqi government was wanted to to deal with it quietly. But yeah, I think the strength of the sort of nationalist reaction was quite surprising.
But you couldn't have written this. The Americans decide they have to have a surge to save their own bacon. They intervene, having actually wanted to get rid of him, to empower Maliki to have a couple of rather spectacular moments. And he's then emboldened to reject the absolutely cardinal plank by which the whole future of America's sort of hold on Iraq is structured. I mean, it's the most delicious sort of situation you could ever imagine.
I wouldn't put it in such stark terms. I mean, first of all, put me right. In terms of the search plan, I think everything is going according to plan. I mean, the search plan, as Petraeus has put it, does not necessarily, and we don't know, does not necessarily involve the 150,000 troops staying in Iraq indefinitely, or even a smaller contingent.
What's that building for then?
I mean, it was building for exactly this.
What is that embassy for?
Well, that is a different plan. That is a different plan from a different era. This is what I'm saying is about sort of the catch-up moment. Wow. There are people who are closer to the ground who are catching up with events, including the U.S. military, by the way.
So you think what's happening is what Petraeus wanted, an Iraqization?
I don't see why not. I don't see why not. He is getting his troops out of Iraq. The U.S. military, the most cherished desire of the U.S. military establishment is to get out of Iraq.
Well, I mean, the General Baptiste is right as there's no post-surge plan, but maybe that's democracy because there'll be a new president. The U.S. military can quite neatly be divided between General Casey, departed Admiral Fallon from CENTCOM, who are desperate to get the U.S. troops out. But beneath them, personified by Petraeus, are those people who want to get the job done, who want to put what they would call sustainable stability in place.
At the back, yeah. Sorry you had to wait so long.
I'm curious, if the Americans are stepping down, who's stepping up? Can you tell us who's the bank? Who owns Iraq? Who's funding the fact that Iraqis are now in charge of Iraq? Are we looking at Iranian ownership, Saudi ownership? Where is the power? Where's the money? And where are we going in the future?
It's in your petrol tank, isn't it?
I mean, that's the point that Yaha made earlier.
I don't know who's funding the government. Who is funding, and how are they breaking down the assets?
The oil exports are funding the government, and there's what's described in Baghdad as a huge bow wave of oil revenues crashing across the Iraqi state, coming through the Ministry of Finance and slowly being dissipated through the Iraqi government at the very time that Congress is desperately trying to hack at the supplemental funding for the occupation. So you've got this growing imbalance between a declining American finance, declining American popularity, declining American troops eventually, and this kind of triumphant Iraqi funding, at least.
It is a staggering story.
It's a staggering story, but I think the danger is to, I mean, Iraq, Yahya's right, it's come a long way from the civil war in 2006-7 to where we are. The ruling elite is still incoherent. The state is still very weak.
I still see Iraq having played, the war in Iraq having played a fairly structural element in the hiking of oil prices, in the hysteria that has hiked, because I don't believe oil prices reflect reality at all, but they're about something else, sentiment, psychology, whatever. And Iraq has played that part. And the return has come, as you've described it, like a bow wave across Iraq, funding the Iraqicization of the country. I mean...
Well, it's funded in a peculiar way. It's funding, the government is a sort of kleptocracy. It's getting this money from the government to the people. You still have 4 million people in Iraq who suffer from malnutrition. The desperate conditions of people sort of living in rubbish dumps and so forth. And there isn't a mechanism from getting this money from the government to the people. So in a way, it makes the government stronger.
Budget execution is in Iraq is definitely a big problem, but it has been steadily improving. There is no question that the Iraqi government, in terms of service delivery, continues to fail. There's 2 hours of electricity in Baghdad still. There are these 4 million refugees, 2 million outside the country, 2 million inside the country, who are not provided for properly, although government coffers are full. But there is great improvement. There are significant strides forward, I think, that are unmistakable.
Come back.
Sorry, gentlemen, I think that's all really interesting, but I'm curious. Where's the money coming from for the future? I don't believe it's coming from the Iraqi government. I believe somebody's funding them. If it's not the Americans, because they have subprime exposure, then who is it? And what assets are they looking at to seize?
There's a simple answer. This is one of the few transparent things in Iraq. The price of oil directly leads to billions of dollars going into the Iraqi Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance himself is a bit loath to let that out of the building, but does. And the money then courses around the green zone, but not out of the green zone into the population, which is Patrick's point. But there's no controversy about where the money's coming from for the Iraqi government. It's coming directly from oil sales.
Controlled through which bank in which country?
The money goes to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and then it's transferred by various means to Baghdad. But don't be surprised that many countries, many other independent countries, channel their monies, oil revenues, through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York just because it's paid in dollars. So that's not just because Iraq is a colony of sorts. That's sort of a normal course of business, and in a way, the fact that the money goes through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has allowed Iraq to know how much money it has.
Are you wanting to hear the other I word?
Yes, I'm curious how much Iran has to do with this, and I'm curious also how much Syria has to do with this, because the last time I heard Jon Snow speak, he was talking about how Syria tortured people, and how Syria was the front line where people were just drifting in through the border, and now all of a sudden the Syrians are good neighbors in Iraq, and they're harboring people and helping them, and I'm just curious how...
Well, I think Syria is a complex story, but I think when it comes to the refugees, there is almost no nation on earth that has done what the Syrians have done for the refugees from Iraq. It is an extraordinary thing that you could absorb 1 million refugees without having to build a camp. That they have been absorbed into the homes and the living rooms and the lofts of Syrian families. It's an extraordinary sight. It's something which I've never seen in any other country.
The flip side that you're alluding to is, yes, the political front of the insurgency has its headquarters in Damascus, and is, if not supported, then has the benign oversight of the Syrian government. I think it's between 20 and 60 suicide bombers are estimated to still come across that border each month. But I think what Yahya's saying is that to a certain extent is largely irrelevant. That what's happened in Anbar, the Anbar awakening, the kind of indigenous kickback against Al-Qaeda makes those men, a lot of them ex-Baathists in Damascus, largely irrelevant at the moment. That you have an indigenous movement, not in any way coherent, not particularly nice in certain aspects, but Iraqi based in Iraq. And I think that to a certain extent cuts Syria out of the picture, but left, once the music is over, with these 2 million Iraqis. Iran is another issue entirely, but of course the great irony of John McCain's position is he's saying that we should get tough on Iran when you look at the people running the Iraqi state, from the president through the prime minister to the council of ministers. A lot of them are either in exile in Iran or had huge and still have continuing links to Iran. And as Patrick said, what stopped the fighting in Basra was the head of the Revolutionary Guards Al-Quds Brigade intervening in a very forceful and not particularly diplomatic way, and saying, oi, get to Qum and we'll negotiate it there. So that you had this bizarre situation where as Maliki drove those troops down to Basra, both Washington and Tehran for that brief moment were in agreement that the fighting had to stop and Maliki couldn't lose.
Yeah, and there is another extraordinary thing, which is that the Iranians are not entirely irrational. What they actually want, what they want is a peaceful deal down on that border. They don't want to run Iraq.
Some Iranians.
What?
The problem with Iran, just like with the US, by the way, is that it has been incoherent.
It's been incoherent, but they have no desire to have a large Shia Arab population.
No, but there is part of the Iranian military establishment who would like to see some sort of revenge for what happened 10 years ago, and who would like to see an extended influence, an extensive influence over Iraq. But that's by far not the...
that's coupled with...
but I think there's 2 basic points. As soon as George Bush and Cheney and the others decided to overthrow Saddam Hussein, 2 things were completely inevitable. One, that the Iraqi Shia would basically take over as the ruling community, because there were 60% of the population. And secondly, that Iranian influence would increase because Saddam was their great enemy and because their co-religionists were going to be in power. And a lot of what the Americans have done, I think, in the last 5 years has not been, and the British has been, not ready to take on board the inevitability of what was going to happen once they'd overthrown Saddam. They tried lots of different ways of having different types of government in 2004, but they've never been quite able to do that. Now you have this strange situation that the 2 supporters of the Iraqi government are one in Washington and also in Tehran. But they
and you have the even more bizarre picture of Mr. Burns, who has sworn time and time and time again never to speak to an Iranian official, on a flight, as we speak, on his way to do what? To speak to the most senior Iranian official any American has spoken to since the revolution in 1979. There's something in the woodshed here, and not all of us are yet aware of what it is, but I don't think it's a cash machine. Any other questions? I think we've given it a pretty good run. We'll take 2 and that's it. Yeah.
You've spoken about the development of the Iraqi state. I'm just looking forward a few years. I'm interested in Iraq developing its own foreign policy as opposed to that which the United States puts on it. I mean, do you think tensions might potentially arise again about the Shatt al-Arab, the access to the waterways over the Al Rumayna field, oil field in Kuwait, and where Iraq might start taking a stance on things like the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Zubari said that there are talks going on, which I found interesting, with the Kuwaitis about the oil field. They're very quiet and they're very low-key, but it's interesting that even at this stage, there are talks going on. He was asked specifically about that question.
I thought that meeting was off the record.
Fuck it, I don't believe it. Sorry, internet. I'm not a member, I was just there.
I think just to answer directly, both a yes and a no. Of course, the great irony of this is when you move through the Iraqi state, when you see the reconstitution of the civil service, of the structures of the ministries, it's still the old boys that used to meet before 2003. The Iraqi state has reconstituted itself much the same, without the Baathists, but the same civil servants, same civil service code, same approach to government that it did before. And that, on that level, that means that the border with Kuwait, long contested by Iraqi nationalists from 41 through will continue to be a problem. But of course, on the other side, why I suspect the Shatt al-Arab won't be a problem is the people running the Iraqi state have had a long residence and a very close relationship with their friends and supporters in Tehran. So as long as this governing elite runs the Iraqi state, I think relations with Tehran won't be as problematic as they have been.
But I think you're getting ahead of yourselves. I mean, I think you get to give the impression that things have really quietened down in Iraq. I mean, yeah, they are better than 2006, as we said. But if you go, I mean, I was talking to two sheikhs, anti-Sadrist sheikhs, powerful sheikhs from Sadr City, who they were saying everybody hates the Mahdi army, things are quieting down, other things. So I said, would you say this in public? You know, they said, certainly not, we'd be shot immediately. And similarly, you know, I was in Mosul, the first was an offensive in Mosul called the Roar of the Lion. Something about the name that make one suspect the effectiveness of. And yeah, you look at the Iraqi troops everywhere, there are police everywhere, but I was talking to the commanders, I mean the Iraqi commanders who were leading it, and I said, you know, are you going to be able to catch Al-Qaeda, anybody from Al-Qaeda? They said, certainly not. You know, they all went to Syria several weeks ago because they knew this was coming. You know, then there are pieces in the paper saying Al-Qaeda has been driven from Mosul. They never actually held any part of Mosul. And several days later, of course, there are more bombs. So, you know, in a way, one can talk, as soon as one starts talking about the future, one begins to give the impression that the present is settled. You know, that you can wander around Baghdad and everything's fine. It isn't. You know, the city is wholly divided. It wouldn't take much, as Toby was saying, for the remaining Sunni minority, if there was another surge of sectarian killing, that they could be driven out of the city as well. This is still, you know, really is the most dangerous place in the world, and also one of the most unstable places in the world. These things that we're talking about may happen, but we're certainly not there yet.
Mm. And one last question here.
Hi. I'm more of a kind of political theorist rather than a pragmatist, but I wanted to ask something that's been kind of troubling me a little bit. When I look at kind of political democratic models, they're usually quite an evolutionary process. I mean, ours is one, France, and the major democratic powers have been a very evolutionary thing. And we're trying to enforce democracy on a country that is so secular and so divided and has been united by a dictator. Do we have the right goals? Are we trying to get to something that's a bit too far out of our reach? I think maybe democracy and that kind of freedom to the people is something that can be achieved, but are we striving too fast? And is that one of the reasons why the problems that we're experiencing at the moment are there?
Say.
Well, I mean, I don't know what's we and doing. I think, I mean, the whole notion of we and doing has ended in Iraq actually pretty early on. Maybe with the departure of Bremer from the Green Zone. And since then it has been a sort of a crisis management, damage control exercise of trying to sort of leave as little as possible of a mess behind. A new Iraqi state, as I have tried to elucidate today, is emerging. It's not going to be a Jeffersonian democracy, although it probably will have mechanisms of elections. It will carry a big resemblance to the other regimes in the region, to Egypt or Yemen or some other places where you have elections, you have some form of free media, but you also have a reasonably or relatively authoritarian government. And Iraq has the resources, has the money to sort of, you know, iron out lots of the cracks. I mean, you know, part of the surge, if I would sum up the surge in one sentence, it was paying, you know, it was taking on the insurgents on payroll. They took 130,000, mostly former insurgents, and put them on the government payroll. First on the U.S. government payroll, and now on the Iraqi government payroll.
And weaponized them as well.
And well, they had their weapons, so they just took the insurgents and started paying them money. And this is what you can do in a country like Iraq, which is going to make $100 billion a year. So it's a regime, it's a reconstituted regime that is based on, a lot of it is based on patronage, at least in Baghdad. Of using oil rents. You know, it's building on some notions of Iraqi nationalism. It's a largely Shia elite, but not exclusively Shia elite. But it's definitely not a liberal democratic model. Kurdistan definitely has a separate is going on a separate track in terms of the way it's building its society. how these two models will come together. As we see, for example, they have completely divergent approaches to oil and the way they want to manage oil. How these two tracks are going to come together remains to be seen. But there's no, there's no illusion anymore in any of the Western capitals, I hope, that they have an influence over the shape of the new Iraq that is going to emerge, as much as they would like to just minimize the damage coming out of it.
I think that's a reasonable thought to end on. I would like very much on your behalf to thank Skype. I'd like to thank the Frontline Club for bringing us all together. But I'd also like, obviously, to thank our wonderful panel, Saeed, Patrick, and Toby. And above all, I'd really like to thank you, because I think it's just been a very, very interesting voyage. And, you've paddled with us. Thank you very much.